So Callie VanBaale serves as faculty in our online program and has kindly joined us from Iowa. Where I want to mention, I was going to put it in, but she worked in social work before being a writer. So just thinking about experience and writing and all the things that you do in your lives that just can be brought to the page and can deepen your understanding of characters, so that's something we were just chatting about. She's a graduate of the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she's the author of essays and short stories, as well as 2 novels. So Callie is the author of The Good Divide, which is over there. She's also the author of The Space Between, The Space Between, which has been newly released as an ebook on Kobo. And she's also having a new book come out. Please watch for her new book, The Monsters We Make, which will be coming out. It's out with agents now, and she can talk about that process. I will mention that today is audience-driven. Students know that, so this is really your time to ask questions and hear from Callie on things that you're interested in about the creative process, about the publishing, the path to publishing. Callie's extraordinary work, which some have called Midwestern Gothic, has been honored with an Eric Hoffer Book Award for General Fiction, an American Book Award, and the Fred Bonney Memorial First Novel Award. As I was reading about Callie's work, I was struck by the observation from Publishers Weekly that fiction doesn't get more real than this. And in reading Callie's work myself, I was struck by the sharp pain of it, feeling made real by Callie's world making, or rather small town making, which she creates through the steady accumulation of daily details. I was struck by how she reveals in small scenes, washing dishes, lugging laundry, the roiling emotions, the dangerous, jagged edges that can seethe beneath the placid surface of seemingly quiet lives. Did I state the sharp pain of it? The Good Divide tells the story of a jealous woman and shows this as not something only petty or creepy, but something terribly destructive. She shows in scene after scene how resentment poisons both the poisoner and the target. And it's an old story, and one I wish would kind of stop, but I could feel it when I read it. It's so vividly given in the casserole dishes, in the clouds of barbecue smoke, in a lace-colored nightgown that hides cut marks, in a kitchen window facing a coveted household. And it just all felt so real that it hurt my skin to read it, but in a really good way, in the way you want fiction, like it's hurting, and it's empathetic and amazing. So, such is the power of Callie's empathetic rendering of what it is to be trapped in our lives. The empathy extends to all the characters in the book. The woman trapped and burning in her frustrated desires, her earnest husband, her husband's brother, who's the unrequited love, and this brother's once vibrant bride who comes to be trapped in a far more terrible hell. Callie's empathetic imagination runs especially deep in her book, The Space Between, in which we live alongside, or rather, because of Callie's skill, we could say that we live with or live as the mother of a high school shooter. We move, as this mother does, from the precious rarity of a peaceful breakfast on the last morning of her son's life, through the press and panic of a high school parking lot, through the devastation of the days that follow, days drenched in memories scrabbling to make sense of disaster, somehow moving through further ruptures towards acceptance and change. The Space Between, sparked by Columbine in 1999 and published for the first time in 2006 and re-released on ebook this year, remains all too timely year after year. The book's school shooting takes place, as it did this year in Parkland, on Valentine's Day. Sadly, fiction doesn't get realer than this. I loved so many things Callie says in her interviews, among them how she speaks of grit, of the hard work of writing. It's a long game. The faculty, we were all talking about that. It's a long game. This takes time. Of being a learner, that is someone who is willing to be stretched, often uncomfortably, to arrive at deeper understanding, at finer skill, as Callie has. And fitting this attitude of learning, I love that her books are compassionately interested in people who make mistakes, who carry them with them, learning to live a different life as they go on. So lest I make the Gong Show, some of you youngins, the Gong Show, unless I make the Gong Show mistake of the too long introduction, please help me welcome Callie VanBaale.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Gillian. And thank you everyone for coming out today to chat and hopefully converse instead of me just standing up here talking by myself. So to get us started just a little bit, I have been writing now for 18 years. I know this because my son, my oldest son, will turn 19 in September, and I started writing when he was about a year old. So pretty much the span of his life has been, I have been at this. And when I first started out, I'm guessing that my writing journey, my writing trajectory has been very similar to a lot of you in the room today. I didn't start out as a writing major as an undergraduate. As Gillian said, I was a social worker. Writing was more of a hobby back then, and it wasn't something I would have ever majored in at that time because I didn't know how people made a living at writing. I didn't know how people, I didn't know anything about publishing. I didn't have mentors who coached me on this stuff or plucked me out of a classroom and said, you have amazing talent, here, let me nurture a career until you publish your first book. I didn't have any of that. I grew up in a really tiny farming community in southern Iowa. I was a farm kid. I came from a very meager background. And so I thought life had to be about how am I gonna feed and clothe myself? That's all I cared about. And it wasn't until I got out of my undergrad program and I was working as a social worker that I realized I wasn't as much interested in the policy of social work as the stories of the people I was working with. And it was then that I realized I'm really in the wrong field. This isn't something I love. What I love about it is a different arm of it. And so I quit around the time my first son was born and started trying to write full-time. I say full-time for those of you in the audience who are parents, because who says, I'm going to have a baby and then write full-time? That'll be easy, right? He'll just sleep quietly when I want to write, and yeah, it never works that way. So it was a good 6 years before I saw a single word of my writing published. Within those 6 years, I went through 2 failed novels that I wrote, beginning to end, that were, I'm guessing, terrible. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no formal training. It wasn't until I started The Space Between that I started to get more serious. And at that time, I had 2 very small children, and we were my husband and I and our boys were a very young family. So I cobbled together my early writing education. I went to conferences, I took workshops where I could, and managed to eke out a novel. And I call that novel, I Didn't Know What I Didn't Know. Right? Like, I had no formal training, so I just didn't really know exactly what I was doing. I was very much just writing off instinct. After that novel was published, I started writing my second novel, and I managed to get an agent. And it was which ended up becoming The Good Divide. That novel went through, I don't know how many years I worked with her. She tried to get it published with big New York publishers, and it never sold. And so I gave up on it and realized maybe I don't know enough of what I'm doing. And so then I made the decision to go back to graduate school. At that time, I then had 3 kids. So that makes a lot of sense, right? So like you, I did a low-res program, very similar to what some of the students I work with at Lindenwood who are doing it online, but back to grad school I went. And it was in graduate school that I started to learn the language of not so much what was wrong with the books that I was writing sometimes, but what I was trying to do. I finally had language and words to describe, this is what I'm trying to do here. And before, I didn't know what it was. I didn't have the proper or the exact terminology for it. And so I worked on a third book when I was in graduate school. I graduated, I finished my MFA on a Sunday. On Thursday, Sunday to Thursday, my agent quit and dropped me, and dropped all her clients. So I was back to square one. So now I had this very expensive master's education and no agent to help me sell now 2 books that I had on my hands. And it took me a good 2 years to find my second agent, which she represented the book that I worked on in graduate school. That was my creative thesis. I worked with her for 2 years. Once again, that book never sold. In the meantime, The Good Divide was picked up and offered a contract by a small press publisher, Midwestern Gothic. A book I had left for dead. I had thought was done. It had no hope. I had just moved on emotionally from it. And it's almost like, you know, sometimes when you say, oh, I never want to get married, I'll never meet anyone, that's like right the time that you meet someone and then you end up marrying them. It was kind of like that. I had said, nothing's going to happen with this book. It's done. And then I connected with a publisher for it. However, at the same time, the third book did not sell, and that agent dropped me. So I am now on my third agent, who represents my fourth novel. So every step of the way, I have taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I always seem like I have 1 book done and ready for publication, while 1 has been left on the side of the road, like a broken down car. So that is where I'm at this point. So I have published 2 books with small presses. I've published several short stories and essays in various journals. I have a lot of advice on agents. I know a lot about agents, but have not gotten the next big step, which is, you know, a mainstream publisher. So that's the gist of my publishing story. At this point, let's just open it to questions and talk about whatever you are curious about, questions on your mind. Yes. Yes, so to make sure everyone heard the question, she was asking about parenting and making time to write. How do those 2 coexist, and freeing up headspace so that you can be creative and think freely, because children are not very conducive for that kind of free thinking for any of you who raise children. So in my early on, I had the exact struggles you're describing. I don't know if it was the fatigue of parenting or the emotional investment parenting takes that it drained my creative well most of the time. I never truly figured out an exact answer for it. The only thing I managed to do was I figured out that once my family was awake, that was where my ear was always tuned. Like, even if they were in another room and they were under the supervision of someone else, if I could still hear them, that's where my attention would divert. So the only way I could write and be remotely creative or productive was I had to get up when they were unconscious, like not awake, like they were asleep, not making noise. And for a long time, that was 1 hour in the morning, and that was it. And that was all I could do. And I wrote the space between almost entirely on that schedule. I just picked away at it little by little. You know, maybe that 1 hour was 2 pages, less than a page, maybe it was 4. And I just had to accept that this is what I can do right now. I have other things that I have filled my life with, and I have to accept that they also take time and emotional energy that will sometimes deplete my creative my creative well. And I think that is probably the same for anyone who is working a very demanding full-time job, who has a spouse or a significant other or a home, or, I mean, the list goes on and on of the things that drain our creative energies. I think artists have to just figure out when they're most productive, when they're the least distracted. For some, it's, you know, for an hour in the morning. Others, it may be for an hour very late at night. Maybe they're night owls. And that takes trial and error, I think. And then also, you have to understand that that may change. You know, it may change with your life as your life changes. You know, where you were a night owl in your 20s, you're not so much in your 40s. Not that I'm speaking from experience, but so I've learned to do that. I've learned to adjust to where I'm at in life. Did that answer your question?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, so the question about handling agents, the relationships with agents. So I found my first agent after my first book was published. I went to a writers' conference in Key West, and I went on a scholarship, and all the scholarship students were given the option to meet with a visiting agent and his wife, who was a writer. His name was Russell Volkany, and he at the time was Ann Tyler's agent, so this was a big deal to get to meet with them. So you submitted 50 pages of your work in progress. They read it and they gave feedback. So I gave them the 50 pages of it. At the time, it was The Good Divide. He read it and was interested and said, well, finish it and send it to me. So I did. He read it and then passed me along to a junior agent who was just building her client list, and he thought we would be a good match. So her name was Joy. So I started working with Joy, and Joy was incredibly young, and she was, I mean, literally just starting out. She had, I think, interned under the owner of the agency, and then was starting her own list. So looking back, I realized she was learning a lot along with me. Like, I'd never had an agent, so I didn't know any different. But looking back, I now realize she was very, very inexperienced. And she was super sweet, and she was, I think, a little too easy on the editing at times. Like, she would, if I got a rejection from an editor, she would send me the rejection and say, okay, so this came from Simon & Schuster, and even though the editor said it was too dark for her taste, I still really think, and it's just, and then she would like write 2 paragraphs pumping me up, which I loved at the time because I didn't know any better. However, the book didn't sell. So I think Joy struggled. She moved agencies a couple times, and she struggled to make sales, and so she just left the agenting business altogether. She dropped all her clients. She gave most of us a couple recommendations to try another agent, but she was done. In fact, I think she's now a juvenile parole officer in upstate New York. Like, that is how far she got away from publishing. So I spent 2 years querying new agents, and I went through a couple revisions with 2 who then passed before I finally signed with my second agent. Her name was Jill. So I've had Joy, Jill, and Julia. Like, I've had this weird pattern. Jill could not have been more opposite of Joy. She was older, she was very established, she had an excellent sales record, and this was a businesswoman. Like, she was in the business of selling books. That was all she cared about. And she did not have time to hold my hand or send me encouraging emails. She would send me revision suggestions, and she wanted them done. So a complete 180 from what I'd had the first time around. And it took some getting used to. However, I saw how much quicker editors responded to Jill, and I probably learned, it's probably hard to quantify how much I probably learned from Jill. She was very hard on my writing. She was very hard on me. But I think she pulled out a lot of trouble spots in my writing that I had really never been aware of. And if I was wanting to sell traditionally, I needed to figure this stuff out. I needed to address it. A lot of stuff with plot and how are we going to position this book? What is the market? Who's the audience for this book? A lot of those bigger questions that you don't have to answer when you're writing to learn. So my emails from Jill would be Grand Central passed, and that's all it would say. Or she would say, Random House said no, Jill, and that's it. She just didn't, that just was not the type of agent she was, and that just wasn't what she was about. And so when that book didn't sell, she reached a point where she said, it's time to shelve it. Finish the book you're working on now. I'll take a look at it. If we can sell that one, then we might be able to come back to the third one to sell to whatever publishing house you land with. So I started sending her pages of the fourth one, and she did not like it. I think we went through 4 rounds, and finally on the 4th round, she said, I don't want this. And I'll release you. You are free to take this to another agent. And that was one of my lower points in writing and publishing. I had already had one book that didn't publish. Now I had a second one, or this next one with her. I was orphaned again. I was going to have to start all over. And I started feeling like maybe I have no idea. I have no ability to see my own writing. If it's decent or horrible, I have no idea anymore. And I was really at a crossroads, like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. That's one of those moments where I was like, why am I trying traditionally published? This is nothing but disappointment. And my husband said, because of course, if you have a significant other, they suffer all your ups and downs. And he said, well, good grief, she's one agent. At least try a few more and see. So I started another query list, and I think I started with a list of 10 agents who by this time I'd been working in the industry for over a decade. And so I'd made a lot of connections and met a lot of writers and their agents and someone who knew someone who knew someone. And of that 10, I got offers from 3. And then I was able to choose out of the 3 which one I wanted to work with, and that's how I ended up signing with Julia, who I feel like is my, what's the old fairy tale? The first one was too soft, the second one was too hard, and the third one was just right, Goldilocks. So she was my just right, and she has been the perfect in the middle. And now, after working with Julia, now I understand, okay, Joy was young, she was very inexperienced. Jill was probably just a little too tough for my personality. I just need a little more interpersonal interaction. And sometimes that is what happens with agents. You go through, I have a friend who's on her 5th agent. I mean, it's not uncommon. Some writers, you'll meet writers who say, oh yeah, I've been with my agent for 15 years. That's, I think, getting more and more rare. Most writers change agents, they change editors, they change publishing houses. It's just a fluid industry where people come and go. And sometimes, you do sign with an agent and they're not a great fit. And it's okay to stand up for yourself and say, I don't think we're the best fit artistically. Business meets art. And to try someone else. It's a scary step to have to start all over, but it's okay to advocate for yourself. I'm a big believer in that. So that's my agent horror stories. How much time do I spend on plotting and outlining? So it's been different with every book that I've written. I've now written 4, and I've written all 4 of them slightly different. So the space between, I wrote completely out of order. I started, as Gillian said in her description, that book came to me, was inspired after the Columbine shooting. For those of you who are old enough to remember it, in 1999, I was pregnant with my first child when that happened, and that was a really weird time to be getting ready to become a parent, and with all this unfolding in the news. And oddly, I found myself thinking more about the parents of the two boys who committed the shooting. Not that I was thinking insensitively about the parents of the victims, but I kept thinking, what the parents of the shooters, what will their lives look like from this day forward? What did they do on the morning it happened? Didn't they assume and worry for their own children, for their own children's safety, having no idea it was their boys who had done it? And that was the image that I started with. And so I wrote that scene first. And from there, I just kind of started writing whatever image I was seeing that day. And then I started this thing where I was kind of free journaling to get to know the main character more, the mother of the shooter. Her name is Judith. And those sort of free writing ended up they evolved into journal entries that became part of the story, that helped tell part of the story. So when I felt like I maybe had enough material, I put it all together in order. And this is a method I personally do not recommend, because once I had it in order, I had continuity problems, I had plot holes, there were just a lot of issues I had to go back and fix. I think I managed to pull it off because that story was probably my least plot-driven story, so I got away with it. The second novel, the structure, I approached that one very differently. I wrote it originally in 3 parts. There was part 1, part 2, and part 3. And I split it based on time. So I told the 3 times in chunks. And I wrote them one chunk, then I wrote the next chunk, and then I wrote the next chunk. So I didn't really have an outline for that one either. I just had an idea of what was going to happen in each part. Once again, that approach and structure didn't serve me very well, because when I sold the book, the editors, their feedback was the chunks, the parts were a little disruptive and a little disjointed. So I ended up having to dismantle all 3 parts and layer it into 2 storylines that were unfolding in 2 different time periods, but side by side. Once again, not the best approach, because it took a lot of revision. The third book, I have to admit that because I was in graduate school, I was always frantically trying to meet deadlines for creative work assignments. So I was basically just writing furiously to produce whatever I could produce to get the pages turned in that were required. So I didn't even take time to outline. I just wrote it very quickly, just to make the assignment deadlines. So with the 4th novel, I decided this time I'm going to think this through more. And I did outline for the first time ever. And it worked. I felt like I wrote that book a lot more efficiently than I ever have. I don't think outlines work for everyone. It's not. I think once again, it's a very personal, every artist's process is very different. And I'm always perplexed when I hear writers say, you should always outline, or they say, you should never outline. Well, that's a really personal thing to tell someone else how to do it. That's like telling them how to hold a pencil. It's that personal. Like writers need to they'll figure it out themselves, what works best. I will say this, I think a lot of writers who write very tight schedules, you see writers who publish like a book a year, a book every 2 years, they are writing off outlines. I think most of them will admit it too. That's how they write them so quickly. Because you can do a lot of your structure and plot editing right there in the outline. So if you know you are more of a plot-driven writer, this will probably be a process that might work for you more. However, if you are more of a, what I call like an organic writer, you want to see where the story takes you, you want to see where the character takes you, that might not work. That might take some of that surprise, that let's see where this goes, let's see where this takes me, out of it. And I think sometimes that's a little bit personality driven. Like if you like organization and you want to know, like if you are, I'm a schedule person, so like I want to know where I need to be, what time, what I need to do. So I think outlines probably just simply suit my personality a little more. Yeah. Yes, so he was asking about the main character of The Good Divide, a character named Jean, who she does suffer from some hidden depression, and she's also a cutter. She's engages in a lot of self-harm in the story. And the story is set in the 50s and 60s, so this was a time when people didn't really have language for some of these behaviors, some of these expressions. So it's a very repressed behavior for her. It's very secretive and hidden, probably more so because of the time period. So I'll answer that in two parts about how I got into the mindset of Jean and how I tried to avoid glorifying maybe or sensationalizing some of what she was going through. So I can say this out loud because both my mother and my aunt know this. So that book is based, it was very heavily inspired by my own mother and my uncle's wife. So I grew up on a dairy farm. It was owned by my dad and his younger brother. And it's no secret that my mom and my aunt, her sister-in-law, had a very contentious relationship that I grew up with my entire life, with a lot of anger and bitterness. And sometimes Midwestern women can have a distinct passive aggressiveness that can go on, at least in my family it was. And that was my whole childhood. I mean, I grew up with that from day one. So I was very interested in and influenced to write about women who just don't air their hurts and their grievances and find a way to move past it and find a way to coexist peacefully, and instead invest in their anger and in their pain. So that was my starting point with Jean. And as I said, I do have a background in social work, so so like my minor was in psychology. I had studied a lot of this in school. And so I've always carried an interest in mental health. It comes into everything I write in some way a little bit. It just is one of those threads that carries through nearly everything I write. The element of Jean expressing her feelings and her hurt and her anger through self-harm, that evolved later, in a later draft. When I first started writing Jean, I had created this very jealous, angry character who has this contentious relationship with her new sister-in-law. And in an early draft, the agent I had at the time, she was my first agent, her comment was that she just couldn't feel or understand Jean's pain herself. To her, it looked petty, I think was the word she used, which is, that's a pretty dangerous word, when you're trying to create an interesting, complex character, to have them called petty. You want someone to stay with them for hundreds of pages. So when I went back to revise and examine the character of Jean, I started thinking about that one of her defining traits was how repressed she was about her feelings, her pain, and all this baggage, personal baggage she carried. And so I started rewriting an early scene. It's one of the first scenes in the book where she's at a picnic and she's carrying this beloved bowl. And I had had the scene written for in many drafts where in sort of a moment of anger, she smashes the bowl and shatters it on this slab of concrete outside. But as I was revising it, I kept writing and she kept going. So she broke the bowl, but then she sits down and then she picked up a piece of the glass and then she pressed it to her arm, and I had a moment where I was like, am I going there? I think I'm going. I think she's taking me there. And she cuts herself. She opens her skin. And that was one of those moments that's hard to describe when you're creating characters where they do something you don't expect. When you let them go and really let yourself go as a writer and let them surprise you, because sometimes they do take you to really unexpected places that you never intended. You know, even if you're an outliner or whatever, you know, part of the magic of writing is you can't teach it. Writers just have to let it happen, where they leave space for their characters to speak for themselves and take that story somewhere where the writer maybe hadn't intended. So once I had that scene revised and it was the first scene I wrote where she cut herself, I had a revision plan where I started reworking her, and I understood her better. Like, she does act petty on the outside, what other people see, but she has a private life that is sympathetic, and she does have an expression for her pain, as maybe unhealthy as it was, and that's how that evolved. And I think maybe I tried to avoid being too gratuitous about it, because it is an expression of pain. It wasn't to be, I wasn't trying to, it wasn't a device. I wasn't trying to use it as a gimmick. It really came organically. Maybe that's the answer. I felt like it came organically. I felt like weirdly, Jean told me this was what she was doing. And I trusted the character. And so I sent it back to the agent and I said, okay, I've revised her. I'm not sure you're gonna like this. And she read it and she said, I get it now. Okay, I get it now. I could feel the woman's pain, and I don't claim that as something I figured out on my own. I think I just, because I was so smart or whatever, it was one of those moments where I just let the character keep going on the page, and something kind of unexpected came out. Yeah. How do I get past the insult? It's true, I do feel very close to my characters, and I do think I start writing from a place of character more so than I start writing from a place of plot. And I struggle with plot more than I do with character because of that, and I openly admit it. So how do I get past the insult of if I get negative feedback about a character? I think the answer to that is I don't necessarily get my feelings hurt. Sometimes I don't know how to fix it. I've gotten so close to these characters that I can't see them any other way. And so if I get feedback that maybe a character is petty, or I was able to sort of managed to do some revision on the second book with the Jean character, but I was never able to overcome it with the third book, and that's the one that did not sell. In that book, I had worked on some version of that character for something like 20 years. I wrote a version of that character as an undergrad for a one-act playwriting contest when I was like a sophomore in college. And then I rewrote it as a short story, and then I rewrote her as a novella, and then I rewrote her as a novel, and then I worked on her for my creative thesis. Like, you don't get more invested in a character than 20 years with the same character. Like, obviously I have trouble letting things go too. That's an issue I fully admit. But that was one where, so when my agent, she got very close to selling it to an imprint of Simon & Schuster, and I actually got an editorial letter from an editor there who said, we're very interested, but we have some thoughts and we'd like to see a revised version first. So she sent me this long editorial letter, and a lot of it was about the main character. And sort of like, she was a little annoying, or she was a little frustrating, or they just weren't engaging, they weren't connecting with her. That's great publishing talk. I just didn't really connect with her. And I gave it my best to revise it, but I just couldn't do enough to save it in order to sell it. And that was just the character that I had. And there wasn't much I could do to change it. And I was telling Gillian that book became a lesson that I have to learn to think about books that don't get published, not as failures, but as that book was a classroom. That was a personal classroom, and that was what it was meant to be. That's maybe why I kept coming back to it in so many different versions, because that book I was learning every time I worked on some draft of it. So it wasn't wasted. Even, it will probably never see the light of day in print, but it served its purpose. It's hard to sometimes accept that, because especially if you put in a lot of time into books, but if you're learning while you're working on it, it's not time wasted. It's a small comfort, I know, but that's a good question. Do I recommend that for like all writing, all characters? After that particular discovery, I do think it opened up something maybe that I had not understood in previous writing. I had it happen very briefly in the first book, where Judith, there was one scene where she did something I hadn't quite expected. It just kind of wrote, but I didn't really stop to think about it. I didn't really stop to try and ponder how that had come to be, how that scene had come to be. This scene where Judith slaps a teenage girl. But I did think about it after that evolved with Jean. So yes, I do think I recognized it enough then in books after that, where when I could feel it happening, and I recognized it, like, okay, something's happening. The character's starting to evolve and do something I hadn't planned. So I don't know how to teach that. I don't know it's not really a method. It's just maybe allowing that there are going to be parts of this story that just happen, that you cannot plan. And I've worked with writers in the past in workshops and in writing groups, and I can tell when I'm working with a writer and I'm reading their material who have a white knuckle grip on their character's behavior. There's just something kind of like they have a leash on them. And I never quite know how to tell them, just unhook the leash just for one page and see what happens. Like, really unhook it and see what this woman does, or see what this man does, or whoever the character is. Just loosen the grip and write and see what happens. But there are just some, I don't know if it's a fear of losing control of the plot, or losing control, like, oh no, I can't, I'll just go off on a tangent, and then I'll have the plot will be ruined. And but my question to that is, well, it's a draft. It's, your first draft is not for a reading public. It's for you. That's it. The only person who has to read that first draft is you. So you can let it get as messy and unexpected, and you can let it go off in those tangents, and then reel it in if you have to. because you're the only one reading it. You know, it's the polished version that you send out for other people to read. But sometimes it's hard for writers to let go. Did that answer your question?
Very much so, thank you.
Yes, so he's asking about moving between short story, novel, essay. That is a great question. How do you make those sort of emotional and mental transitions between the two? So I have found that novels are all in. Like, they require so much mental focus because it's such a large amount of pages, it's such a huge plot, there's so many characters, and for continuity, it's to keep all the wheels on that bus. That first draft, I have learned, and I try to teach this with my online students, that first draft is all about what I call hot fingers. Like, you just have to pound out that first draft, beginning to end. If you stop, if you disrupt that momentum, it's very hard to get it picked back up. I know a lot of writers who write their first drafts in 3 months, like as short amount of time as they can, just to get that working draft, because you can't edit a blank page. So at least with a first draft, no matter how messy or how many problems it has, you have something to work with. You know what you have on your hands. So I like to do a draft and then put it away and then work on like a short story, or I'll write an essay, because I have found that I can get like an essay or short story draft in a day or two, and then I'll go back to the novel, I'll work on it for however many months or how long I work on it, and then I can come back to that short story or essay anytime because it's so self-contained. I can very easily revise and edit it sort of whole piece. So I like to use short stories and essays almost like a palate cleanser between novels, because novels are exhausting. They really are. I get done with a novel and sometimes I don't write for quite a while. I just, in fact, finished a draft of a novel, turned it into my agent in May, and all I did since May was revise one short story. And that's it. I was pretty exhausted, and I just needed to sort of let my mental and my emotions kind of come back down and just live life a little bit. And I think, plus I think I think short stories are a completely different beast than novels. Sure, they're both fiction, and they share a lot of the same craft elements, but they really, like a short story is like a perfect sprint. Like, you have to come right out of the blocks and run the most perfect 100-meter dash you can run. Whereas a novel, you're running laps and laps around the track. You have a lot of room to stretch your legs, and so they take, first of all, different emotional investments. But the structure of them is also so different. I think trying to go back and forth between the two, some writers probably do it pretty easily. And like writers who also write poetry, that just blows my mind, how they can write across all genres. But that's the only way I can do it. I'm a very self-contained project person. I have to work on the novel. When that's set aside or whatever, a draft, then I'll work on a short story, or yeah. The only time I get into real trouble is when I have to edit one while I'm trying to write another, and I struggle. I don't do it very well. I lose momentum, and then it takes me a long time to get back into the one I've been working on, and but it's part of the business. You can't plan those schedules. You get edits when you get them, and you have to get them done by a certain date. It's just some of that you just have to adjust to as best you can. Yes? Sure. So Well, my main experience has been small press, which is very different from the big five, you know, like the New York. I've had 3 agents, but I have not yet published a book with a big publisher. So I have not self-published before. And I will fully admit, for one reason, I'm too lazy to do the marketing myself. That is the only reason. It's a lot of legwork, and because I've published with small presses and I've had to do what I've had to do with them, with their help. I mean, that was even with their support. It was exhausting, and I'm not great at it. It's not something that I think that I have as a personal skill. So if it were solely on me, it would be a struggle. It would be a real struggle. And I think there are some self-published writers who are, they're also probably pretty good at marketing, and they're not shy about marketing. It comes pretty naturally to them, so self-publishing probably makes sense. And I think most writers have different goals for their work. Like sometimes in one of my MFA workshops, one of the students will say, this is a memoir, I'm gonna finish it, but I don't have any plans to like mainstream publish it. I'd like to self-publish it and share it with you know, a select number of people. And so they have a clear goal for what they want from that book. And I think that's when it makes sense. Yeah. So I'm not completely closed off to self-publishing. I mean, I have an unpublished book that I could. It's just a matter of I'd have to take the time, and I just am a little bit lazy to pull the trigger and do it. Yeah, it's a big commitment to get a self-published book up and then get it out there and where people can find it and buy it. And I've just never been willing to take it on. I think self-publishing is really changing versus when I started 18 years ago. You know, 18 years ago, self-publishing was just sort of a vanity. Like it was always called vanity presses, and it was all in print. So you'd see these poor writers carrying these huge boxes to book festivals, massive boxes that they paid $3,000 to get printed, and then they were trying to hand sell them to people at trade shows and things like that, and it just looked kind of miserable. And it was this, so then they had, you know, $2,000 worth of books sitting in their garage. That's not how self-publishing is so different now. It's very, you know, the digital, having the digital option completely changed it. It took away a lot of the financial burden. And I think writers now often do it because they want control over it. They desire control, and they want their own vision in it. And you know, when you publish traditionally, there's compromise. There just is. You work with an agent, you work with an editor, and all of them have input, and there will be changes made. You will rewrite. And I'm comfortable with that. I'm okay with that. Some writers aren't, and that's okay. I think that's a personal decision. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question at all. Yes, I remember the moment, a perfect moment to answer your question. So I was working with my third semester advisor. She had read, I think, 40 pages of the novel I was working on at the time. And she said, so I think what you really need is you need to figure out what the raison d'etre is of this novel. And I said, what the hell? I don't know. What is that? I don't know what that is. And it's a French term that means reason for being. And she said, what is the why here? Why now? Why does this novel have to start today? Why is this story for this character? Why does her story need to start today? And suddenly I was like, oh, there's a word for that. Okay, interesting. And that was like the first time I really understood, like, oh, there's all kinds of terminology to talk about the craft of writing. I had another short story workshop where the instructor talked about the fulcrum of a story, the perfect balancing point where the story then tips and starts to change to the end. And that was another word that once there was a word for it, then I understood how it functioned in the story, or maybe how it should function in a story. So I could not only talk about where I could not only talk about examples, like good examples, but then I could try and start diagnosing in other work with language and definitions that someone else could understand. And that's the, that kind of writing background, craft, having a craft background is how that became so valuable to me, being able to dissect and discuss it, why something maybe isn't working or why it is. And this is the reason, not just because I don't like it, or not just because I really like it or I love this book. No, what are the mechanics that are making this book chug down the tracks the way it does? Yeah. Have I ever had a deadline?
Yeah, I mean,
where
submissions or something coming up, even when you were in grad school, in fact.
A deadline where I had ideas and I couldn't get them down?
Yeah.
I feel like that's probably been every project I've ever worked on, honestly. The book I just finished was one I was on deadline for the second agent because the one book hadn't sold, so she said, well, hurry up and get me the new one you're working on. And I sort of hit a wall with it. I think I had sent her 50 pages, and she didn't like the first 50 pages, and I got really stuck. I knew where I wanted the book to go, but it didn't seem like she agreed or she liked what I was doing, and it completely paralyzed me. Even though I had ideas to keep going, or I had ideas, or I had a vision of what I wanted this book, I was completely paralyzed. What I ended up doing was I stopped sending. The only way I got through that was I told myself, well, I'm not going to send her sample pages anymore. I'm just going to write the whole thing. I have to see what I have. I just have to try it. Just let me try it. If it fails, it fails. But I won't know if it could or couldn't work unless I try it. So I just started writing it, and once I gave myself that permission, I became unstuck, and the draft came, and I got it done. Of course, she didn't want it, but that's a different story. But it was the idea that I started with, that I was able to get dislodged, and on the paper. And I often have like a lot of ideas for short stories, banging around in my head, but if I'm working on a novel, I don't want to stop working on the novel to then work on a short story because that's really disruptive. So sometimes I have to take just a few notes for an idea and come back to it later and just say and hope that the enthusiasm for it is still there. It's a risk, but I have to really rely on momentum in novels. Yeah. So when do I do the development of the characters? Are you talking about research?
Yes, exactly. Would that be your downtime when you're trying to just put everything aside, and do something that's a bit more relaxing?
Yes, I do all my research up front. Sometimes I have to go in and look things up as I'm writing. I see a lot of head nodding. I think that's really common. But I do the majority of my research up front. And the reason I do that is because I'm a writer who I play off research really well. Like sometimes I'll read a nugget of research and that will become an entire part of the story arc that I would have never otherwise thought of myself. Like this is a good example. So when I was working on The Good Divide, I did all my research on 1950s and 60s agriculture and dairy farming in Wisconsin. I did it all ahead of time. And as I was doing the research, I came across randomly a website for this program in Wisconsin called Alice in Dairyland. It's like a pageant where they crown, they have Alice princesses, and then they crown the Alice in Dairyland every year, and then she becomes the agricultural ambassador for the state. And now it's a big deal. It's a big scholarship program, and like these are really successful young women. But in the 50s and 60s, it was really more of a beauty pageant, and the girls, the Alice in Dairylands, mostly just went around grocery stores and gave out cheese samples. And I loved that so much. It ended up becoming a big part of the story in one, and then later another character, in who she was. And I would have never had that had I not done research ahead of time. So I'm pretty reliant on research beforehand. But I set a limit because it can be easy to go down a rabbit hole of research and then not actually write. Because research is kind of fun if you enjoy it. And you can really procrastinate writing if you're researching all the time. It makes you feel like you're writing, but you're not really writing if you're researching. So that's how I use research. And I put a limit. I do my research before I start a novel. So like I'm getting ready to start a new book in September when my kids go back to school. And this summer I started doing the research. Like I set up my interviews for someone I needed to interview, and started doing some of my reading. I got a couple books that I needed. But I did all that this summer, just kind of, in my spare time. Yeah. So I write my first draft longhand in spiral notebooks. And then after I write a chapter longhand, I then type it into the computer and kind of clean it up. And I save the documents individually, so I can go in and out of them as I need to. Then once I have most of the chapters, I transfer them. I copy them into one long document, and that's what I work off of. I know a lot of writers who use Scrivener and love it. I just have been too cheap to pay for it because it's by subscription. But I do create my own sort of version of Scrivener where I put my chapter outlines, like I have a rough outline that I start with that I type, that I work off of. And then as I write the chapters and as the characters and the plot become a lot more detailed, I add the details in as I write them so I can remember what has gone into each chapter. And then that way, and I keep track of the word count. So then that way by the end, off that outline, I can see the percentages of where the story arcs are hitting. I struggle with that a little bit. Like I said, plotting is a little bit of my Achilles heel. And I work well off being like saying, okay, it's a 300-page novel. Here at page 40 in Act 1, we should start to see this happen or whatever. So that's how the outline also helps me, and I work off of that. However, I think Scrivener, is it Scrivener or Scribner? V? Okay. I didn't want to keep mispronouncing it. Scrivener. I think that program does some of that for you. So I'm probably doing it the hard way. But it's just how I've always done it. And once you find your process, people get into habits and they don't like to change them. And I'm very much like that. I have storyboarded before, though, when I had one particular plot, the third novel with the agent who was so hard on me. When I was trying to revise with her, I storyboarded the entire plot on my wall with color-coded Post-its. So I could see, like, I put action on bright pink Post-its, and then I put thought, like sort of what interiority happened in that chapter in blue, and then I put backstory, if there was any, in green. So then I could visually see how much each chapter was and where it was falling. And that was pretty useful because I could see some chapters where like the pink was pretty thin. There wasn't a lot of action in there. So sometimes visually that helps writers to see the plot unfold like that in front of them. I've only done it the one time though. I do with certain books. There are just certain styles of writing that that frustrate me, and so they just don't really interest me. I feel like the mark of a good book is if I put it down and I'm like, oh, I should never write again. I can never write that good. This is so depressing. Like if it depresses me for my own skill, then that's been a good book. That's been a good book for me to read. I think writers should read as much as possible. And I think writers should read what they themselves want to write. I think like if you're getting your MFA in the academic world, that's the perfect environment to be pushed to read things you wouldn't normally. And I credit my time in the MFA program into getting exposed to like personal narrative essays and flash fiction and even some forms of poetry, like I'd never heard of erasure poetry or anything like that. And I think writers should have that breadth of reading because this is your industry. It would be like, you know, buying from a car salesman who knows nothing about, he only knows, you know, the Ford Taurus, but he doesn't know anything else about any other Fords, just the Taurus. That seems like kind of a, you know, it's your profession. You're the expert on this. This is what you're dedicating your life to. So I think, why wouldn't you then, you know, read as much as you can? But it is sort of the downfall of once you learn the craft of writing, then you start picking the mechanics apart. It does happen. Even books I really enjoy, there's always something where I'm like, well, I would have done the ending differently, or I wouldn't have done that. I think that's natural, and it's a hazard of the job. The more you learn, you know, the more you see the wizard behind the curtain. It just happens, you know. I always wonder how actors can ever enjoy a movie again, you know, because like they know how all that works. How do I encounter silence? Do you mean like dry periods of writing?
Yeah.
I don't encounter silence. I don't encounter completely dry periods of writing. However, I sometimes get a partial idea for a story. What I often get is a premise, but I don't have the conflict that will then make an entire novel. And I have sat on some stories, like a premise, for years before an actual plot, full-bodied plot, finally came to me. The book I'm just getting ready to start, I stumbled on the premise of it. It was the son of a friend, this health situation he went through. I was so fascinated by it, and I thought there's a story there. There's a story there. But I knew enough that it was only a premise. It was just a setup. It wasn't enough. I didn't have enough to it yet to make a full novel to write about. And I just sat with it for like 1 year went by, 2 years went by, nothing. I just nothing inspired me or struck me like, what is this man's story? Okay, so this happens, but then what? And I had nothing. And it wasn't until last year that finally, I was watching an episode of Dateline of all things, where I was like, that's it, that's the rest of it. He goes here, and then this is what happens after that, and that's the story. I had to just sit on it though, and hope that the rest of it would present itself. That's the closest I get to like silence or dry periods, or do you mean like complete not writing at all?
No, I think we answered that.
Okay. I think sometimes just being patient and letting the story evolve and present itself to you, it may take a while, but I'm a believer in, I have faith in storytellers, that the story will come. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming out and the great questions. Thank you, Gillian and Beth.